Hello, welcome to Lafayette, Oregon, the land of ghosts, legends, and tales, apparently. Before we enter the cemetery, and you probably see it in the title, I'd like to thank Johnny Edwards for allowing me to film and do my little YouTube documentary here at this cemetery. My channel's on, kind of the small side. It's one of the smaller ones on YouTube, but I'm enjoying it, and I hope you guys are. But I do appreciate his blessing to visit the cemetery and do a little filming and talk about the pioneer stories. So thank you very much. So with that beginning said, welcome to another episode of Forgotten Cemeteries of Pacific Northwest. Today we're at Masonic Cemetery, Lafayette, number 3. It's located in Lafayette, Oregon, Yamhill County. Alternative names, I didn't see any for this cemetery, and the reason that number 3 is in there, I guess there's 3 Masonic cemeteries: Lafayette, McMinnville, and Sheraton. So let's go meet some of the local residents and hear their story. All right, a little bit of history about the cemetery. We have an establishment date at 1855 and 100 to 500 burials per the Oregon Burial Site Guide. Find a grave is shown around 308 memorials to give you an idea, 381. This is the cemetery that pretty much has it all. Consumption victims, Civil War veterans, pioneers, obviously, young deaths, very old deaths. We have our first individual executed via hanging. We have the famous Lafayette Witch legend, which I didn't know much about till I started researching the cemetery. We have a Revolutionary War descendants, the Cayuse Indian War vet, 1839 immigrant at a time where wagons weren't used in the 30s. It was more of like fur trappers, and my understanding is they had to travel by horseback mainly. There was no wagons until, I want to say 1836. We'll look at that later. But we have a Yakima Indian War vet, a drowning victim memorial. I think I came across a World War I vet. Pretty much anything you ever thought of in an old cemetery is located here. It has a lot of diversity. I imagine this video will be very long, so apologies ahead of time. Might split it up in 2 videos because there is a lot of history here. I really struggled because it was just like information overload. This cemetery, like many others we visited, had a broken history, vandalized, beat up, neglected, and unfortunately a hotspot for paranormal thrill seekers. Pretty much every video you see on YouTube relating to this particular cemetery is some attempt to stir up the dead, film the witch, or demanding information with questions trying to capture EVPs. EVPs are electronic voice phenomenon. I'm sure you've seen it on the travel show, what is it, Ghost Adventures, stuff like that. Things were looking pretty grim per the usual for a pioneer cemetery, and that kind of seems to be the thing out here. A lot of pioneer cemeteries are getting neglected and forgotten about, but not all of them. This one was on that verge until a guy named Johnny Edwards stepped in around 2017. He started organizing volunteer cleanups, marking gravesite maps, which is very helpful to people like me, and at one time uncovered various hidden gravestones during his cleanup, so that was pretty awesome. He even wrote a proposal and was awarded a state grant to repair and spruce up McMinnville Cemetery from my readings. Unfortunately, Masonic Lafayette, the one we're visiting today, was hit very hard in May 2020 by pretty bad destructive vandalism, and I'm sure you're seeing it right here. And I did my little pre-walk, and man, it is just everywhere. Someone just went to town on this place, unfortunately. During the vandalism event, 30 headstones were wrecked, costing over $30,000 in damage. I'm guessing we'll see some of that today during the tour section of the vid, but from my understanding, there's ongoing efforts to fix up the cemetery, luckily. And Johnny Edwards is a big part of that. He's raising money to fix up the cemeteries in the Lafayette area, including the one we're visiting today. And I'll try to find out more about that. I'll ask him if there's like a link you can donate to or some type of GoFundMe. And yeah, I'll follow up on that. So let's go meet some people. Here is not Elijah, Ellison, Millikan. When you travel to the cemetery, you might pass Milliken Lane Road. Elijah has no marker from my understanding, but his wife Lucinda here does, so we'll just use her headstone as a talking point. Elijah was born in 1805 in Danielsville, Georgia, who was named after Allen Daniel, a major war general from the War of 1812. Interestingly enough, this land is not your land or my land. It belongs to Elijah based on my readings. I read that he's buried on his land, and he got this land we're on right now through a land patent through the U.S. government. Secretary of State records show around 1846 he got a land grant. Not sure if that's the exact one. So pre-Oregon arrival, Elijah married Lucinda Wilson Chris in 1827. Elijah actually built 2 wagons for himself and had 5 oxen to prepare for his family's immigration in the year 1843. His obituary was written strangely that he brought the first wagon to ever cross the plains to Oregon. I'm not sure about that statement, because my understanding was the first migrant trains were back in 1836, because anything before that, the path of the Oregon must be traveled by horseback or foot. And as we talked about before, fur trappers were the ones responsible for kind of developing a roadmap to Oregon during these times. At least my readings show that. But Elijah and his family, he had around 12 kids with Lucinda, but some of them were born before, after 1843, arrived in Oregon. At first they settled in Linton, which is a Portland neighborhood, named after a senator from Missouri, Lewis Lynn, part of the land grant legislation to keep Oregon out of the hands of the English. So felt very strongly about that. Elijah didn't care for Linton apparently, and moved to Yamhill County in 1844. So I'm guessing he donated the land for the cemetery. That's one bit of information that kind of eluded me, like who was the one responsible for donating the land, but that record said that it's his land, so I'm just going to assume that. We do have an establishment date of 1855, so it's kind of making sense. Not a whole lot on Lucinda Cripps though. The only thing information I could really find on her is she was born in Tennessee. Hopefully the camera's at a good angle. This one definitely got hit by vandalism, as you can see. So here we have James Thomas Hembree and daughter of Elijah and Lucinda. We just talked about Malvina. So remember, Elijah was born in Georgia, but at some time they must have been in Arkansas, because it shows Malvina was born in Arkansas in 1832. I think Malvina is an example of how things were a little different back then. Malvina celebrated her 11th birthday on the Oregon Trail. 2 years later, she would marry. She would be 13 at the time and married James Thomas Hembree. I think this quote said it best, and I believe it's from Malvina. Begin quote, "Before the immigration of 1843, there were so few white women in Oregon country that most of the white men took Indian wives. White girls were so much in demand that many of the girls married at the age of 12 or 13. One of my chums was married when she was 12 years old. Mother made me promise not to get married so young, so I waited 2 days after my 13th birthday before I was married," end quote. In 1914, Malvina recalled, "2 days after I turned 13, I married. My husband was 19 years old at the time. When we exchanged vows, I was wearing a new calico dress that Mama made for me, regular store-bought shoes, and even stockings. We took a donation claim of 640 acres and built a cabin which we moved into at once. Within the next few days, my husband made a bedstead out of fir poles, which he peeled and fastened to the wall. He pegged them together, for we had no nails. On this bed, we laid dried ferns for a mattress." Yikes, that must have been uncomfortable. "I took care of the babies, cooked, washed clothes, made soap, candles, and knitted," end quote. So overall, seems like she was a pretty resourceful individual. Her husband, James Thomas Hembree, as you figured out by now, it's on the same headstone up there, his name. Find a grave says pioneer of 1842, but I think that's incorrect. Nobody from the Hembree party is listed on my one source I use for kind of like a list of the Oregon Trail and who came that year. However, the source I use lists a bunch of Hembrees in the 1843 migration, so maybe that's a typo on Find a Grave. Someone on Find a Grave also uploaded a kind of a cool photo, and I'll try to put in the video of the Hembrees and Malvina. Yeah, and I'll put a link to it too if you're interested. James is listed in the newspaper clipping as having built the first house in Lafayette. Not sure if that's true, but would be pretty cool. Also served in the Cayuse Indian War, a conflict that lasted from 1847 to 1855. And we talked about how that whole war started in my Union Cedar Mills video. I'll put a link below to that video because that was a pretty cool story. From my reads, James is one expert hunter as well, and him and Malvina were married 70 years, which was longer than any other couple from the 1843 migration year. All right, on to the famous Lafayette Witch story, and did a little research on this, trying to check the validity of this, and I think some of you will be disappointed out there who are fans of it. So I try to stick to the facts and the research, and I looked at a bunch of things, a bunch of historical articles and such. So we're going to first start off with Richard Ezekiel Gus Marple, who has no marker at this cemetery, but is a famous individual in this area, I'm guessing history-wise. So I thought we'd just kind of look at the very center of the cemetery since he has no marker. Richard was actually born right here in Oregon, Benton County to be exact, in 1861. His mother, Anna Eliza Rosor Marple, is where the whole Lafayette Witch legend comes from, and we'll go into why. There's a local legend of a witch that haunts this cemetery, or Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery. They're not sure in my readings. One of those cemeteries. Was it one of those cemeteries? But it's haunted, all right. Kept coming across that. The typical, like, yeah, well, it's this one. No, it's this one. So, got a little confusing the more I went into the forums. And so, sorry, there appears to be no Sanderson sisters here. This whole story time is brought to you by the confession of Richard's fellow inmate, William Henry Hess. I guess Richard sort of told him everything when he got arrested, and we'll go into why he got arrested. And his roommate was like kind of documenting what the guy was telling him, and then he basically told the sheriff in the end, from what I hear or what I've read as well. So Richard's mother, Anna, was romantically involved with a man named David Corker, who is buried here at this cemetery, and we'll visit his grave. David was also a local shop owner and apparently had some money. He was also known as the individual that occasionally took a drink. The idea of drugging him was formulated between Richard, his mother, and his wife. Then they would rob him, which would be an innocent approach at first. This was like kind of their whole plan. Richard also claimed to have studied medicine and knew what drug to use and how much to use on Corker. What's the old Eisenhower saying? Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Well, this one got a bit messy. So Anna put the drug into whatever David was drinking. Took a while for the drug to take effect, but it did eventually work. Richard would try a few entrances, but eventually would get into a window, finding his mother inside. This is where things sort of fell apart. She starts worrying that if he awakens, she'll be charged with robbery and would be arrested, because at that point it became pretty obvious that he was robbed and he was dating her, and she's the last person he saw before he took that drink. So Richard suggested that they murder David and set the house ablaze. Little extreme. So I guess Anna jumped right on the suggestion and grabbed an axe from inside. She tried hitting David with the back of the axe at first. Not sure what she was trying to accomplish, but her son Richard would take over and use the sharp end and say, hey, it's an axe. Maybe you want to use this end. A little quicker and logical. So after the job was done, they got a whole $206 out of the murder, which by inflation standards today comes to about $6,000, so it's more than you think. They agreed to split the money, but Richard was complaining to his fellow inmate, that his mother was a hog and took all the money. He was pretty angry about that. Richard's story gets a bit darker as well. He went on to brag about other murders he apparently committed, and his inmate was kind of disturbed by the way David Corker was murdered with an axe. He was like, man, what a way to go out. And Richard was kind of like laughing about it. He's like, oh man, I've committed a bunch of murders. That's nothing. So Richard goes on to say that he murdered an old lady in Oregon City. Her last name was Hager or something. He was kind of joking that the old lady put up quite a fight because 3 men attacked her, from what the story said. But in the end, they killed her. The main reason they killed her was because she had quite the check and they wanted the money. He said that the man that was convicted for the murder of the old lady Hager had nothing to do with her murder, so some innocent man got locked up over that, and apparently he was pretty proud of that. Another murder he told about was of a French woman in Portland. Apparently this was a 4-person job and the woman was chopped to death. So the sheriff would question him, find evidence of a bloody shirt, piece of paper, and the guilt on Richard's face was too obvious. They were convinced that he killed Corker. And there was also tools found at Richard's residence that were used for breaking into a house. I don't know what they came up with. Was it a screwdriver and a hammer? I'm not really sure, but it was enough to arrest Richard, who said the stuff was planted on him. That was what he was going with. His mother would be charged, but a lack of evidence got her off the hook, so she went off scot-free, and Richard's wife as well. Richard would be charged with first-degree murder and be set to be executed via hanging November 11th, 1887. 30 people showed up for the hanging. The sheriff ordered a black hood to be placed over his face, and Richard would shout one last time, "Murder, may God judge you all," which is a little ironic given the confession of the story, if true. I guess things went a little wrong with the hanging and the noose, as it sort of slipped, breaking his neck, but he would suffocate for 18 minutes. If you don't know, apparently there's like a whole science to making a noose and guaranteeing it kills you immediately. not waiting 18 minutes. So it was a very bad, ugly death. So here's where the whole witch legend comes into play. Richard's mother, Anna, shouted something along the lines of, "Curse the city, may it never prosper and burn to the ground." There were several fires over the years, but let's be honest, this is Oregon. You're seeing us in the news right now for a bunch of forest fires. All it takes is one little spark out here. It's a common issue out here. To add, a lot of structures were wooden back then, so remember, all it takes is a spark and you have a blaze. Me personally, I'm getting one of my certifications in haz and spill control, and you wouldn't believe what can spontaneously burst into flames under the right conditions. Allegedly, the house in which Richard and his mother lived back then was demolished at some point, and they're claiming that the bloody axe was discovered at that location. Again, I don't know the truth behind that one, but pretty cool little legend. So the famous witch Anna, not even buried here. In fact, not even in the town of Lafayette. She's actually buried at Jacksonville Cemetery, which is a 5-hour car drive south of Lafayette. I believe I read that she died at liver cancer, I want to say. So yeah, not sure about the truth to that legend. Not sure if she was even a witch. There's no evidence of it. So sorry to be a Debbie Downer, but I hope you enjoyed the story. Well, my wife got mad at me because I pointed the camera at her and said, "I got the witch on camera," so I'm sure I'll pay for that later. But we have the headstone of David Corker here, the individual we just talked about that was murdered. Pretty headstone, really good shape, and you can see the iconic symbol up there as well. Like I said, besides his murder, the only info I could find on him was he ran a hardware store in the area, so he's a pretty successful individual. But he's located way in the corner, all over here in a very quiet area of the cemetery. And hopefully that's showing up on the headstone. Peter P. Gates is here, definitely one of the sadder stories in the cemetery, who appeared to be a well-liked individual in the area back then. He was an Indian War veteran, unsure of which particular war he served in, but I believe he was born in 1851. I don't think it's on his headstone, but at least that's what Find the Grave was telling me. There's 3 Indian Wars, I believe, that were really popular in Oregon. There was the Modoc Wars that started in 1850, but kind of escalated in the 1870s. There was the Nez Perce War in the late 1870s as well. Then we have the Bannock War in 1878. Maybe he fought in all of them. Regardless, Peter and 3 other men went for an outing out in the forest. They would decide on a campsite, and Gates would actually make a remark that he didn't like the look of the loose tree limbs. But they decided on an escape route, which I really didn't understand. Maybe they were kind of below a hill and they were worried about branches or tree trunks coming down. It didn't really make sense to me, but if you've ever camped or read a survivalist book, there's something called widowmakers. They're loose or dead tree limbs that hang above your head. You're about to find out why it's a good reason to choose your camp wisely. In the middle of the night, the campers awoke to a crash as the wind picked up. They ran to the escape route that they planned on. Maybe the tree limbs were coming down a hill or something, like I said before. Wasn't quite clear. Gates, when he ran to escape, would trip and fall, unfortunately, and be right in the path of these tree limbs. One of the men tried to reach for Gates, but I guess he got a nasty gash on his arm because his arm got hit. But eventually a tree limb would fall on Gates' head, crushing it instantly and killing him. So pretty sad ending to Gates, who was twice elected sheriff and did a term on the Oregon State Senate, actually, and was very well known throughout the valley. We are seeing, and I hope you can see it, the 3 links there. Hopefully you can see that, indicating the Oddfellows, who live by the command: visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan. And usually sometimes in those links, and I think we saw that at Rafty Cemetery, you'll see FLT letters. That represents friendship, love, and truth, from my understanding. There's a lot of vandalism here, and that's leading to difficulty with finding some of the stories I want to and identifying the people, because a lot of the headstones are kind of pushed down, if you will, from the vandalism, and that has the names on them. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to just do some epic views of the valley, because it is pretty out here. But for sure, my understanding is Andrew Jackson Milliken has no marker out here. He was born in 1834 in Missouri. And if you remember, the Millikens are listed as 1843 pioneers from my understanding. Andrew never married. He was hooked on mining in Oregon and Idaho and traveled around a lot. He lived a pretty adventurous life and had some near misses. He served in the Yakima Indian Wars under Captain Absalom Jefferson Hembree, who is buried at Hembree Cemetery. Sadly, that one is on private property, but it is located in Yamhill County. And if you remember, we covered Andrew Bolin in my Puritan Cemetery vid. You can learn all about the Yakima Indian Wars and how they were triggered there. It's kind of a cool story. April 10th, 1856, Captain Hembree and his crew, which included Andrew, were ambushed by Indians. Indians would kill Hembree in the attack, and Andrew's mule would be shot out from underneath him. So Andrew fled because the story made it sound like he was thrown off his mule during that time or something. And he was fleeing the scene. Running along, he'd heard something behind him, and he thought for sure it was the Indians, and he was about to meet his end. Surprisingly, his mule followed him, only suffering a minor wound. So he hopped on his mule and got out of there. So this is kind of what I'm dealing with and trying to find names. Now, they do have, luckily on the top, you could sort of identify them, but these ones look like they were obviously vandalized and pushed over right in a row. But I was hoping to find Eli Perkins. I haven't seen him yet, and it's just, like I said, it's getting a bit challenging to find the people I want to. He was born in 1786, so our oldest birth year discovered on this channel, so that was another reason I wanted to find his headstone. Find a grave shows him being born in Massachusetts. However, an 1850 U.S. federal census shows him writing New York as his birthplace. And some of the records, of course, spelled his name's Perkins with an I, and do not show him being born in Montague, Massachusetts. So it got a little confusing looking up his history. Montague, Massachusetts was first settled by Europeans in 1715 and is home of the Great Falls Festival, where pumpkins line the streets in falls, apparently. Anyways, Eli and his wife Sarah Barnham Solly Hull Perkins, got enough names, got married in 1809. I read they moved in the year of 1817 to Cattaraugus County, New York. Then in 1832, he would try a new scene in Tippecanoe County, Indiana. Then on April 4th, 1844, they made the big decision to travel the Oregon Trail and come out here. So I always try to bring up an interesting bit of info based on the migration year, because it seems like something was always going on. That year in particular, it is estimated to have around 1,500 individuals who traveled the plains, and 1844 kind of sucked. It was known as the year of rain and flooding. There's a journal entry from one of the travelers saying roads are extremely bad owing to the late great rains. The floods would cause a lot of delays, prolonging the trip even more. We saw before that the average Oregon Trail trip was around 6 months, I believe. Streams turned to rivers, and as if crossing them wasn't dangerous enough, they were even more deadly. Provisions were lost, animals and people died along the trail, so it was a rough year. And let's not forget, 1844 was the year of the Great Flood, the biggest flood ever recorded on the Missouri River and upper Mississippi River in North America in terms of discharge. Thankfully, Eli and his family would arrive in Oregon 6 months later, around November, at the west end of the Blue Mountains, so they did make their kind of 6-month deadline. Here, their one son, John B. Perkins, would break off at the Blue Mountains with his family and go work at for the famous Dr. Whitman by today's standard as a maintenance operator and employee. He's buried at North Yamhill Cemetery, hint, hint, future visit. Eli and the rest of his family worked their way to Yamhill County and scored 40 acres of farmland. Eventually, they would pass their farm on to their son, George W. Perkins. His headstone says Pioneer 1853, so he must have came to Oregon at a later date, but he's buried at Evergreen Memorial Park. So hopefully this headstone's showing up. It's got a bunch of lichens on it, but the camera really helps. We have Elizabeth Betsy Munson Bailey, quite the name. She is from Hartford, Connecticut, born in 1804. It's Munson, not Monson, by the way, on her headstone. That's a comment someone made on Find a Grave that they spell it with an O here, which apparently it's supposed to be spelled with a U. Elizabeth's grandfather, Walter Munson, served in the Revolutionary War under Captain Abraham's Foot Company as a private. I'm putting up a map now. I believe Andrews Ward, 2nd Brigade, is shown at the bottom. That's the one he served in. I believe her grandfather died in New Haven, which is part of the 2nd as well. If you find her on Find a Grave, click through her family history. It goes back like to 1545, so someone went through a lot of trouble to document her ancestors. However, besides having a deep history in her family, her husband, who she married in 1824, Daniel Dodge Bailey, named the town Garibaldi, Oregon, apparently. To give you an idea, Garibaldi is about 1.5 hours west from Portland, and one of the most popular places to go clamming apparently in the state of Oregon. Check out this fancy map I found. Looks like Daniel and his family traveled with the 1845 migration trains. He would be the first white property owner in this area of the Tillamook Bay, and would be appointed as the first postmaster. So I guess you have that advantage when you move there and you're the only guy. Sadly, Elizabeth would die at the age of 50 years old in 1855. I couldn't find an exact cause of death, but it looks like Daniel came to Tillamook in the 1860s, and that's when he named the town of Garibaldi. Confusingly, documents say that Garibaldi was incorporated in 1881 or 1946. That's quite a gap. However, if you need to escape the world, Garibaldi's current population is 800. Why is it named Garibaldi? Let's hear the epic story of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was condemned to death before he turned at the age of 27. Giuseppe was a patron and general of Italy, and also played a major part in the unification of Italy. One source referred to him as one of the greatest generals of modern times. Really being put up on a pedestal here. Somewhere along his life, he was fighting for independence for Italy and was sentenced to death he would luckily escape the country, or however many countries they had there. I meant to pull up a map of old Italy. And he would travel to South America. He spent 14 years in exile. However, this would benefit him because he earned trust with a particular army over there, and he learned guerrilla war tactics. He also got involved with something called the Uruguayan Civil War, so he was picking up some new tactics, new knowledge, styles to fight, to attack. The Uruguayan Civil War, also known as the Spanish as the Guerrilla Grande, was a series of armed conflicts between the leaders of the Uruguayan independences. Giuseppe would return to Italy in 1845 and commanded and led in the War of Independence over there. He created a special unit of troops called the Hunters of the Alps. Giuseppe would go on to command several forces and basically unify Italy, capturing cities, Sicily, southern Italy, and Umbria. One historian called him the only holy admiral figure in modern history. So you could see why Daniel Bailey admired him so much and named a town in Oregon after him. So if you ever visit there, then you could tell the whole story of Giuseppe and Daniel Bailey. So here's Mary Ann Molly Alderman Bird. Everybody here has like 18 names. Interesting person. Her father first came to Oregon in 1849, so pretty early, kind of late by our standards, kind of a midpoint. Her and her mother came to Oregon in 1853 at a later date, traveling the Isthmus of the Panama. Because remember, around 1854, the Oregon Trail was very dangerous. You'll have to see my Puritan Cemetery video if you'd like to know more about that. And we talked about the Ward Massacre, which was not pretty. Back to Mary, she would marry a man named Robert Phelps Bird, who was the owner of a very large general store back then and held a county seat in Yamhill. He then went on to be the county judge, so he was a pretty successful dude. Mary would live from 1847 to 1940. So imagine the technology she saw and the progress she saw in traveling in general. She got to experience the steamboat by travel. I imagine she got to see some of the wagon trains coming in, the creation of the first cars, even though the steam tricycle was developed in 1769. I came across that bit of info. And finally, the plane. But even more confusing, a guy developed a patent for the flying machine in 1857. So I'm learning way too many things about history, and everything I thought was true was not until you kind of dive into it. Mary's father was apparently friends with the Tillamook Indians, and sometimes they slept over at her father's house. Mary also remembers the Native Americans bringing pieces of Nehalem beeswax. And if you like a good treasure story and hunt, I suggest a book that explains the legend, and I'll put a picture of it in a link below. I've been reading that one. That one's really interesting. It was written long ago. One of the reasons I picked her headstone was she was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, which from my understanding is a sister organization to the Freemasons. It was established in 1850 but not approved till 1873, and was open to males and females, in addition being open to all religious beliefs. So that was kind of cool. The order has held charitable causes such as Alzheimer's disease research, juvenile diabetes research, and juvenile asthma research. The behemoth you see before you is the Burbank Memorial. Pretty unique headstone. Eva Burbank is also listed right in front of us. You probably can't see it, but maybe I'll show it during the tour. From what I've gathered, she was swimming at the North Shore of Oregon, Ilwaco Beach to be exact, which is located in Ilwaco, Washington. She went a little too far out and got swept away and drowned, unfortunately. Her body was never recovered, but we have this epic monument here in her memory. Evelyn was only 19 when she died. And here we have Mary E. Warden. Now, I thought Cornelius Cemetery had the saddest epitaph, and that had a little 10-year-old girl who was dying and asked her mom, "Do the girls know I am going away?" A little heartbreaking, but this one right here takes the cake. This will be the new leader. So she is age 2, and it reads, "The little crib is empty now, the little clothes laid by, a mother's hope, a father's joy, in death's cold arms doth lie." Pretty sad epitaph. So hopefully it won't come across the video, but somebody keeps flying a drone over the cemetery, and it probably has one of those cameras on it. I guess they're a little sensitive maybe about the cemetery being been vandalized pretty heavily, so there is the flip coin of it. But we're here at Jacob Labo's headstone. Actually, there's a lot of people listed on it, as you can see. Another one of the older birth years here, 1795 to be exact. It appears Jacob bounced back and forth between Oregon and Indiana. He made a final road trip to Oregon in 1862, so kind of a late arrival. He is the son of a Revolutionary War vet, Francis Isaac Labo. Very French sounding, and that was my attempt at French, so I'm sure that sounded bad. And that's because he served under the Regiment des Soissonnais, who were part of the French army. Only info I could really find on them was that they fought at the Battle of Fontenay, 1745, and the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. We're probably familiar with that, during the American Revolutionary War. Another fun fact was Jacob's father, Francis, is buried at Van Bursick Cemetery, located in Bean Blossom Township, Indiana. The cemetery is often referred to as Little Arlington Cemetery because it has soldiers buried there from every U.S. war but World War I and II. So that was a bit of interesting information to come across. And here we have Sidney Smith, born in Fulton County, New York in 1809. Sidney is our earliest Oregon arrival, the date I believe, in 1839. A dangerous time to travel the plains. He's also the son of a Revolutionary War captain. We seem to have a few Revolutionary War descendants here, and I have to wonder if Dar did a run through the cemetery. They're usually pretty good about that, the Daughters of the American Revolution. To add, Sidney is the nephew of Ethan Allen, not the furniture store that you're thinking of. He was pretty famous for a few reasons. He captured Fort Ticonderoga, I think that's how you say that, in 1775 with the famous Green Mountain Boys, a militia whose origins go back to 1770. Their flag is still in use till this day in the Vermont Army National Guard, Vermont Air National Guard as well. This capture was minor, but it would have implications for the British because it basically broke communications between the northern and southern British units. Ethan Allen is also one of the founders of Vermont. So Sidney here on the left had some big names to follow up on, a lot of pressure on him, I imagine. Sidney would find himself in Ohio in 1833. I read a source that he set out for Oregon as early as the spring of 1839 with 15 friends. From my understanding, this was the first organized immigration to Oregon with plans for a permanent location. So we're looking at one of the first immigrants to take a shot at Oregon and just say, I want to live there permanently. Sidney would be part of the Peoria Party specifically. Their goal, simply to raise the American flag and run the Hudson Bay Company out of the country. Apparently they had their own flag, which read Oregon or the grave. Their journey would be difficult and dangerous. I read it was more due to their ignorance and just not following the proper path. Journals showed as well that they had storms, hunger, accidents, Indian run-ins, and a lot of disgruntled individuals in the traveling crews. I guess there was constant disagreements within the party and it dissolved at times. Sidney specifically accidentally shot himself during an argument with another party member, I guess. The bullet had to be extracted with a pocket knife. His wound would be fixed up, but Sidney was carried on a cot strung between 2 horses for several days until he could mount a horse again. He would split from the party at one point. Not sure if that argument caused him to split off, but his new party would struggle as well, living off game when they could. At one point, they were so low on supplies, they bought the flesh of dogs from Indians just to eat. The horses were also stolen at one point by the Sioux tribe. Sidney and one of his friends named Oakley must have really loved their horses because they stole the horses back, which was obviously dangerous and just outright crazy during this time. But here we go again. During this whole rescue operation, Cindy's rifle would discharge and he would wound himself during the event, but I guess he just blew it off. He's like, dude, I just want to get to Oregon. So he just said, I'm fine. They would somehow finally reach the Dalles in 1839. In 1846, he married Meanda Nancy Bailey Smith. She was a pioneer of 1845. And if you remember earlier, we talked about Daniel Bailey. She's his daughter. From there, I read he was Sidney was a farmer at some point, got into the mercantile business as well. Unsure what he sold. Another cool factoid is that Nancy and Sidney planted an acorn tree in 1849, which is still standing to this day. Another source claims 1846, but still a long time ago. Coincidentally, this is the grave of Ewing Young, who was found underneath the tree, who was the first settler in the Chelan Valley, apparently in the year 1834. FYI, February 9th is Ewing Young Day in Oregon, and in my search I discovered the Ewing Young Distillery, so you can go there and get tanked and visit his grave at the same time. What might be the most unique memorial in the cemetery is of Melissa Johnson and Leona English. Markers tend to stick out because of the interesting pipe design around, and they got these little things. I'm assuming those are for flowers. Both children, unsure if they're related, but definitely a unique one. Their deaths are pretty far apart. Melissa dying in 1853 at the age of 4, with Leona dying in 1877 at the age of 3, but again, no relation. They're not sisters or anything, but kind of unique.